dapat po munang alamin or matukoy ang pangunahing problema ng bansa upang mapagtuunan ng pansin at mabigyan ng solusyon.
We should have specific goals, do research, and make a policy that is fair for everyone.
Walang problema sa pulisiya. Iayos lang ang pagpapatupad.
Bago patubas ang batas, pag-aralan muna gusto ng government.
Two things, clarity and execution. Both, you need the communication and monitoring. As simple as that.
Mandato ng Philippine Institute for Development Studies o PIDS na gumawa ng mga pag-aaral at pananaliksik ng mga pulisiya at programa ng pamahalaan at magbigay ng rekomendasyon sa mga mambabatas sa pagbabalangkas ng mga pulisiyang makakatulong sa ating bansa. Sinusulong ng aming ahensya ang evidence-based policy making upang bigyan diin ang kahalagahan ng pulisiya na batay sa datos at policy research na sumusuri sa tunay na kalagayan ng ating mga komunidad. Napakahalaga ng policy research, lalo na sa mga panahong dumadaan sa krisis ang ating bansa.
Kapag pulisiya ay pinag-aralan, susulong ang bayan!
In need of references for your research? Do you want a digital library that you can access for free anytime and anywhere? You don't have to look far. SERP-P is here for you. SERP-P is an online database of socioeconomic materials produced by the Philippine Institute for Development Studies, government agencies, research and academic institutions, and international organizations based in the Philippines. It is the country's first online repository of socioeconomic information, created for policymakers and development practitioners, researchers, educators, and students. To access SERP-P, just visit the PIDS website and click the SERP-P widget under the Databases tab, or type serp-p.pids.gov.ph. SERP-P has a wide variety of materials such as journal articles, books, research papers, working papers, policy notes, audiovisual materials, and more. As of 2022, SERP-P has more than 60 partner institutions contributing knowledge resources to the database. SERP-P provides a comprehensive coverage of references encompassing 22 research themes: labor and education, gender and development, poverty, technology and innovation, trade and industry, and many more. On the enhanced website of SERP-P, you can filter your research by keyword or author, publication type, research theme, or year published, all at the same time. SERP-P has more than 7,000 publications and audiovisual materials that you can access and download for free. What are you waiting for? Visit SERP-P now. Socioeconomic Research Portal for the Philippines, innovating knowledge exchange and policy research.
So what is PIDS? For over 40 years, the Philippine Institute for Development Studies, or PIDS, has been the country's foremost socioeconomic think tank. It conducts rigorous and objective policy research and analyses that help the government in crafting relevant policies, plans, and programs in support of the country's long-term vision and development goals. PIDS pursues its mandate through three basic programs: research, dissemination, and outreach. Through its research program, PIDS identifies and prioritizes studies, develops proposals, and conducts research on priority areas. The results of these studies are then disseminated through different platforms, publications, online resources, PIDS Corner, seminars, and the Development Policy Research Month, or DPRM, held every September. To shed light on key policy issues, the advice and expertise of the Institute's research fellows are also sought by policymakers, government agencies, private sector, and civil society. Since 1977, PIDS has completed numerous policy studies on a wide range of development topics. This brand of service has then translated to policies and programs that have improved the lives of every Filipino. Philippine Institute for Development Studies, service through policy research.
Dapat po munang alamin or matukoy ang pangunahing problema ng bansa upang mapagtuunan ng pansin at mabigyan ng solusyon.
We should have specific goals, do research, and make a policy that is fair for everyone.
Walang problema sa pulisiya. Iayos lang ang pagpapatupad.
Bago patubas ang batas, pag-aralan muna gusto ng government.
Two things, clarity and execution. Both, you need the communication and monitoring. As simple as that.
Mandato ng Philippine Institute for Development Studies o PIDS na gumawa ng mga pag-aaral at pananaliksik ng mga polisiya at programa ng pamahalaan at magbigay ng rekomendasyon sa mga mambabatas sa pagbabalangkas ng mga polisiyang makakatulong sa ating bansa. Sinusulong ng aming ahensya ang evidence-based policy making upang bigyan diin ang kahalagahan ng polisiya na batay sa datos at policy research na sumusuri sa tunay na kalagayan ng ating mga komunidad. Napakahalaga ng policy research, lalo na sa mga panahong dumadaan sa krisis ang ating bansa.
Kapag pulisiya ay pinag-aralan, susulong ang bayan.
In need of references for your research? Do you want a digital library that you can access for free anytime and anywhere? You don't have to look far. SERP-P is here for you. SERP-P is an online database of socioeconomic materials produced by the Philippine Institute for Development Studies, government agencies, research and academic institutions, and international organizations based in the Philippines. It is the country's first online repository of socioeconomic information, created for policymakers and development practitioners, researchers, educators, and students. To access SERP-P, just visit the PIDS website and click the SERP-P widget under the Databases tab, or type serp-p.pids.gov.ph. SERP-P has a wide variety of materials such as journal articles, books, research papers, working papers, policy notes, audiovisual materials, and more. As of 2022, SERP-P has more than 60 partner institutions contributing knowledge resources to the database. SERP-P provides a comprehensive coverage of references encompassing 22 research themes: labor and education, gender and development, poverty, technology and innovation, trade and industry, and many more. On the enhanced website of SERP-P, you can filter your research by keyword or author, publication type, research theme, or year published, all at the same time. SERP-P has more than 7,000 publications and audiovisual materials that you can access and download for free. What are you waiting for? Visit SERP-P now. Socioeconomic research portal for the Philippines, innovating knowledge exchange and policy research.
So what is PIDS? For over 40 years, the Philippine Institute for Development Studies, or PIDS, has been the country's foremost socioeconomic think tank. It conducts rigorous and objective policy research and analyses that help the government in crafting relevant policies, plans, and programs in support of the country's long-term vision and development goals. PIDS pursues its mandate through three basic programs: research, dissemination, and outreach. Through its research program, PIDS identifies and prioritizes studies, develops proposals, and conducts research on priority areas. The results of these studies are then disseminated through different platforms, publications, online resources, PIDS Corner, seminars, and the Development Policy Research Month, or DPRM, held every September. To shed light on key policy issues, the advice and expertise of the Institute's research fellows are also sought by policymakers, government agencies, private sector, and civil society. Since 1977, PIDS has completed numerous policy studies on a wide range of development topics. This brand of service has then translated to policies and programs that have improved the lives of every Filipino. Philippine Institute for Development Studies, service through policy research.
Welcome to the PIDS webinar series. Before we start our virtual event, we have some reminders. For attendees, your microphone is automatically muted upon entry. If you wish to join the discussion, click the Q&A icon, type your question, and click send. For Facebook viewers, you may send your question using the comment section. Remember to keep your questions concise and direct to the point. We will screen all questions to ensure that they are relevant to the webinar topic and the presentation. The moderator will read the questions during the open forum and cover as many as possible depending on the available time. This webinar is being recorded and live streamed on the PIDS and SERP-P Facebook pages. The recording will also be made publicly available on the PIDS YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to your active participation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our virtual forum on the theme Act Now or Pay Later, Enhancing Disaster Risk Governance for a Resilient Philippines. I'm Sheila Siar, your host and moderator. Our public webinar this afternoon was organized by the Socioeconomic Research Portal for the Philippines project of PIDS. SERP-P is an initiative of PIDS that started 22 years ago to serve as a common link between the government and research institutions and provide an open access repository of socioeconomic information. Currently, the SERP-P network has more than 60 partner institutions, mostly from the government and academia, bonded by a shared passion for research and knowledge exchange. One of SERP-P's initiatives is this knowledge-sharing webinar series, which features the studies of SERP-P partner institutions to stimulate public discourse on key development issues and promote evidence-based policymaking. For our fourth installment in this series, we put a spotlight on disaster risk reduction and management in support of National Disaster Resilience Month. To formally open our event and give us more information about today's topic, let us listen to PIDS President Aniceto Orbeta Jr. for his message. Sir, over to you.
Thank you, Sheila. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our virtual forum on the theme, Act Now or Pay Later, Enhancing Disaster Risk Governance for a Resilient Philippines. Let me start by acknowledging the following officials who took the time from their busy schedules to join us today. Development Bank of the Philippines Vice President, Maria Berriña Tipasi, the Department of Interior and Local Government Director, Attorney Rolene Javier, Alliance for Safe, Sustainable and Resilient Environments, or ASSURE, President Nathaniel Von Seidel, BRAC International Philippine Program Director, Maria Bailon, Planning and Development Research Foundation, Executive Director, Dr. Tabasam Rasa, Swilig Family Foundation President and Executive Director, Oster Panadero, Local Government Development Foundation Deputy Executive Director, Dr. Antonio Avila, and Mindanao State University Marawi Director, Mahid Rahman. I would also like to greet the various representatives from government, academia, the private sector, civil society, and media virtually present today, and those watching through the PIDS and SERP-P Facebook pages. I welcome you to this fourth virtual forum organized by our Socioeconomic Research Portal for the Philippines Project, or SERP-P, in support of the National Disaster Resilience Month. We are devoting this webinar to discussion on disaster-related issues in the Philippines and how we can address those challenges, guided by the studies conducted by some of our SERP-P partner institutions. The Philippines is geographically vulnerable to natural hazards such as typhoons, earthquakes, volcanic eruption, landslides, and more. The threats to climate change have made it worse. According to the United Nations report, the global size and quality of ecosystems have already declined by 47%. This can continue at a rate of at least 4% every decade due to human activities. Based on the World Risk Index in 2022, the Philippines is the most disaster-prone country in the world. Data from the Philippine Statistics Authority put the total economic losses caused by natural extreme events and disasters from 2010 to 2019 at a staggering value of 463 billion pesos. Effective disaster risk reduction and management is vital to reduce the loss of life, damage to infrastructure, and economic losses caused by disasters. Effective DRRM systems can reduce the negative impacts of disasters and improve the well-being of Filipinos. Part of an effective DRRM system is sufficient and timely funding to caution the harmful effects of a disaster on the economy, repair the essential infrastructure, and reinstate essential government services. This afternoon's presentation will help us identify lessons from the past disasters and explore policy solutions for enhancing the country's disaster risk governance. I want to thank the SERP-P partner institutions and their presenters participating today to share their studies. We have Dr. Sheila Atienza of the University of the Philippines Center for Integrative Studies and Development Studies and the UP Department of Political Science, who will present the disaster risk governance and resilience during the Supertyphoon Yolanda. Executive Director Novel Bangsal of the Congressional Policy and Budget Research Department, who will present about managing a disaster trust fund for the Philippines. And our very own DRRM expert at PIDS, Dr. Sonny Domingo, who will talk about payment for ecosystem services. To all our SERP-P partners, thank you for your continued support. Let me also extend my gratitude to the Commission on Higher Education led by Chairperson Prospero Rivera III for supporting PIDS by issuing a memorandum recently encouraging all public and private higher education institutions to use SERP-P as a knowledge resource. To all our Zoom and Facebook Live participants, thank you for spending your Thursday afternoon with us. You can also tell your colleagues and friends who are interested in this webinar but who missed this afternoon's presentation to listen to the recording of this and other PIDS webinars in our PIDS websites under resources, knowledge materials, and videos. Let us participate into this discussion by listening to the presentations with an open and inquiring mind. Let us not hesitate to ask questions and share our ideas as well. To end, I wish to highlight that all of us can help shape the narrative of our nation's resilience. We all are responsible for our future and have a role to play. For our policymakers, we must not forget the lessons from the past disasters and use data and evidence to inform our policies. Thank you. I now give back the floor to our moderator. Sheila.
Thank you very much, Dr. Orbeta. So for setting the tone of today's conversation, and at this point, I'd like to invite Dr. Orbeta, our speakers, and our SERP-P coordinator, Zeki, for a brief photo opportunity. We will be assisted by our platform host, Ms. Mai Lagman. Mai, please.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for your turning on your video. So ready? 3, 2, 1. 1, 2, 3. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mai. So I'm sure all of you are excited to listen to the presentations. To start the ball rolling, we'd like to hear from you first, and we would like to know your thoughts on the following poll questions. Please, Meili. Okay. So our poll question for today is on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being the highest and 1 being the lowest. How ready do you think is the Philippines to respond to disasters, or in Filipino, sa sukat na 1 hanggang 5? 5 bilang pinakamataas at 1 bilang pinakamababa. Gaano kahanda ang Pilipinas sa mga paparating na kalamidad? So to answer, you may scan the QR code flash on the screen or click the Mentimeter link on the chat box. And this poll is also open to our viewers on Facebook. Just click the link on the comment section. Okay, so I hope you have answered already. So at this point, let us take a look at Menti for the results, please. Okay, so we have around 87 respondents, and the total average is 2.6. So that reflects our yung perception natin ng kahandaan ng Pilipinas, which is mababa, no? 2.6 lang. So hopefully itong mga pag-uusapan natin sa araw na ito ay makatulong kung paano palalakasin ng disaster risk governance sa ating bansa para mas mapaghandaan natin yung mga disasters. Okay? So we can close the poll now and we can listen to the presentations. And our first presentation will revisit the Supertyphoon Yolanda and the lessons that we can learn from that experience. So please help me welcome the author of the study, Dr. Maria Ella L. Atienza, professor at the Department of Political Science, University of the Philippines, Diliman. She is also the co-convener of the Program on Social and Political Change of the UP Center for Integrative and Development Studies. Professor Atienza's research interests include local politics and governance, health politics and policy, and human security. She was co-investigator in a 3-year project on urban poverty alleviation in Yolanda-affected areas in Leyte, and co-author with Pauline Eby and Maytan Mullins in the book Urban Poverty in the Wake of Disaster Resilience, Poverty in the Wake of Environmental Disaster, Rehabilitation, Resilience, and Typhoon Haiyan, published by Routledge in 2019. Dr. Atienza, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Ma'am Sheila. Good afternoon to everyone. And thank you to PIDS and Dr. Orbeta for inviting the UP Center for Integrative and Development Studies to contribute in your very important webinar. Let me share my screen. Okay, I hope you can already see my my slide. So as mentioned by Ma'am Sheila, what I'll be presenting to you would be some of the lessons learned from our 3-year study on Supertyphoon Yolanda. We did our study before the pandemic, but I think some of the observations and some of the lessons that we pointed out in our publications can still be useful as we prepare better for future disasters. Okay, so very briefly, I'll not discuss point by point the outline of my presentation, but I'll give you a brief background of our research, what we did, and then since I'm a political scientist, I will focus on the multi-level governance structure in terms of disaster risk reduction and management, and look at how they operated during Supertyphoon Yolanda and afterwards during the relief and rehabilitation stage, what have been the impacts of interventions on, we use the framework of human security and resilience in our study, and of course, the lessons for disaster risk governance and resilience. And incidentally, this is the 10th year of Supertyphoon Yolanda. So it's also good to look back and see some of the lessons. Have we learned our lessons from that very devastating super typhoon? So without dealing so much about our project background, it's a project in partnership with the University of Nottingham of the United Kingdom, its campus in China, and the University of the Philippines, funded by the United Kingdom's Economic and Social Research Council and the Department of Foreign and International Development. And the implementing unit of this research in UP Diliman is my department, the Department of Political Science. But of course, we would not have done the entire research without the help of other UP campuses, in particular UP Visayas in Tacloban, and which is now an autonomous unit of the University of the Philippines, and our colleague, our quantitative expert for the project is from UP Manila. So it's a 3-year project which ran from March 2015 to 2018, and our overarching aim would be twofold: to identify strategies that work in relation to poverty alleviation in post-disaster environments, and to ascertain the conditions necessary for the success and scaling up of these strategies based on the case of relief efforts in selected Yolanda areas. We focus on urban population risk, the vulnerability to disasters, and resilience towards environmental shocks. And we use the framework of resilience and human security. Our practical objective is to assess 20 barangays across Leyte affected by Yolanda, and we selected Tacloban City, Palo, and Tanawan. We use a number of research methods: documentary review, key informant interviews of various stakeholders, household surveys, focus group discussions, and family interviews. And we repeated the process for 3 years to see how people assess their situation during, before, during, and after Super Typhoon Yolanda. So in terms of our framework, we use human security and resilience. When we say human security, we're looking at it in terms of 3 dimensions: freedom from fear, freedom from want, and freedom to live in dignity. According to the Human Security Report, when we talk about human security, it addresses the protection of people, meaning both individuals and communities, from critical and pervasive threats to their lives, livelihood, and dignity, including the downside of development. In terms of approaches, it is composed of the top-down or protection approaches, as well as the more important bottom-up or empowerment approach. In terms of resilience, we refer to it, according to quote Rodan, as the capacity of any entity, an individual, a community, an organization, or of a natural system to prepare for disruptions, to recover from shocks and stresses, and to adapt and grow from a disruptive experience. So definitely, resilience is linked intimately with vulnerability and capacity to address the vulnerability. And it focuses generally on marginalization as a source of vulnerability. And in that process, it is very much linked with the human security approach. So the human security approach targets the vulnerable and directly addresses factors that increase vulnerability to poverty, disease, conflict, and disempowerment. It also requires mechanisms to be established at different levels of government and to focus on governance to protect communities from threats. Communities, particularly the marginalized, like the urban poor, the persons with disabilities, women, and other marginalized sectors are the most effective locus of disaster preparedness activities, and hence must define their own resilience. And in our study, we paid particular attention to 2 areas of post-disaster resilience: shelter and livelihood. As Director Orbeta mentioned, the Philippine setting definitely is geographically prone to natural hazards. It's in the Pacific Rim of Fire, very prone to earthquakes, volcanoes, and typhoons. We are ranked 4th by the Global Climate Risk Index among countries most affected by extreme weather events from 2000 to 2019. And we are the 5th most vulnerable country in terms of disaster risk implications for development capacity. We also, of course, understand that in the Philippines, we face inequitable growth and high poverty, and we're also experiencing, until now, the longest running insurgency in Asia. So for our research, the Leyte province, which is located in Eastern Visayas, in 2012, it was the poorest region it was noted as the poorest region in 2012. It was also characterized by huge economic inequalities when Typhoon Yolanda hit, and it's also a struggling local economy still dependent on natural resources like agriculture. And of course, for political scientists and public administration scholars, we have long noted the continuing patronage politics and the dominance of local elites, particularly political families. So in terms of the impact or the immediate effect of Super Typhoon Haiyan in 2013, the total damage according to the NDRRMC data of 2014 was 1.8 billion US dollars. In terms of recorded dead, 6,193, 1,161 missing, and 28,689 injured. People were affected in terms of livelihood, environmental, and food security were 16 million, with nearly 4.4 million displaced. So when we look at what is the national framework, what are the national frameworks guiding the Philippines in terms of responding to disasters, the Philippines is a signatory, and therefore should be observing the framework set by the Hyogo Framework for Action and the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. And these two frameworks actually transform the way we see disasters. That when we look at disasters, we not only talk about relief operations, but we should actually talk about disaster prevention, disaster risk reduction, and preventing more people and livelihoods from being affected by impending disasters. When we look at laws regarding disasters, the Philippines actually has a strong set of policies, frameworks, and plans for DRRM. The DRRM law of 2010 created the NDRRMC and established local councils at various local government levels to replicate the NDRRMC's responsibilities. It also recognizes the role of civil society organizations in DRRM. We also have the Office of Civil Defense under the Department of National Defense, which is the implementing arm of the NDRRMC. We also have the Climate Change Act of 2009, which places disaster risk reduction as the first line of defense against climate change risk. So in terms of laws, we are not actually lacking in terms of guidelines and frameworks on how to deal with disasters and impending disasters. However, in reality, local councils are often understaffed, under-budgeted, or lacking professionalization and awareness, and a significant gap exists. The NDRRMC cannot supervise all the local councils. And when Typhoon Yolanda hit, there were LGUs without DRRM plans. And even if they have DRRM plans, some of them have no adequate staff or budget to actually support their plans. In terms of general guidelines for foreign and international agencies, DRRM assistance, there are points for partnership and coordination with foreign and international agencies. There's a national government cluster system and the United Nations cluster system under the UN OCHA, which actually pre-existed Hayan. They were existing even before 2013. They were set up after the devastation caused by Ondoy. There's also an existing parallel system with the Armed Forces of the Philippines through the Multinational Coordination Council. So we are part of a multi-level governance structure regarding DRRM. So the UN cluster system, this is the UN cluster system in terms of humanitarian and emergency relief coordination. And there are specific UN agencies in charge of specific areas like what to do before, during, and after disasters. And this is replicated at the level of the Philippine government, where we have lead agencies in terms of specific areas when it comes to disaster. So nutrition, water, sanitation, emergency shelter, logistics, education, and agriculture. However, there are limits despite having a national institutional framework. Some departments during Typhoon Yolanda bypassed the NDRRMC coordination and the Office of Civil Defense, and they work independently. Even the creation of the Office of the Presidential Assistant for Rehabilitation and Recovery may have added another level and further confusion in terms of which agencies are really in charge of rehabilitation. Despite substantial devolution and coordination frameworks in place, many of the local government units have limited technical and financial capacity, and in the process got overwhelmed by the devastation or uninformed about the protocols or procedures needed, or they have other priorities other than disaster risk reduction. Many local constituents were informed about the super typhoon before the typhoon hit, but many of them were reluctant to leave for varying reasons, and they were also uninformed about what to do during disasters. Political rivalries also between the national and local governments, political alliances, and patronage politics got in the way of more efficient response. We definitely saw a very big role of foreign and international agencies right after Yolanda. Some observers noted that countries were far more generous than usual. The UN emergency response pegged their response during Yolanda as L3, which was the highest. And according to the DBM in 2015, the Philippines received 1.64 billion cash and non-cash aid pledges in US dollars. And according to UN OCHA, the estimate is 865,151,806 US dollars from UN OCHA alone. What have we noted about the interplay of the national and local frameworks with international and foreign agencies in terms of their interventions during Typhoon Yolanda? Based on various assessments, the national government played an integral role during the response efforts, with the international UN cluster system joining the government cluster system, and with most foreign agencies saying that coordination was good for the most part. However, different reports also highlight significant tensions between the government and international NGOs, as the latter's response led to the sudden influx of international actors, which undermined the usual procedures and relationships established by the Philippine government. Some foreign agencies also did not consult government agencies and communities in terms of priority needs of the community. We also noted that there are cases of different actors working in parallel and duplicating their efforts, alongside cases of exemplary programming and collaboration. Parallel efforts occurred because of the following, and this is based on our interviews and our analysis. Some national NGOs were unaware of the cluster system, and the system also did not actively engage national NGOs. Some LGUs were also unaware of the cluster system, or they were weak because of the disaster. Some international NGOs, organizations, and individuals distrusted the national agencies, local governments, and they avoided collaboration and coordination. They went straight to certain sectors and communities. Coordination was also difficult due to the scale of the disaster. The MDRRMC also has a number of weaknesses and limitations, and the AFP had difficulties. Remember that in 2013, there was also the Bohol earthquake, and before that, the Zamboanga siege. So the results were market distortion. Many families and individuals received multiple cash and other items, but others did not. For instance, some NGOs went directly to the people without consulting NGOs and local government units about which areas should be prioritized or which areas require more assistance. So the tendency was there were those who received more duplicated aid while others did not receive anything. We also noted a number of exemplary programs. Of course, this is not an exhaustive list. This is only based on what we have observed and often mentioned by many of our informants. The UN WASH and protection clusters, they were successful interventions because long before Supertyphoon Yolanda, they already have a history of engagement with many players in the area. The UN OCHA, of course, which was familiar with the terrain and how to work with national and local actors. Catholic Relief Services, UNDP's Holistic Livelihood Programs, World Vision, Oxfam's new standard operating procedures. They were able to adjust in terms of localizing the responses and the interventions immediately after Yolanda. And the Pope Francis Village was an example of a relocation site which incorporated the voices and the participation of the people in crafting what would be appropriate livelihood programs for people who relocated in this particular village. We also noted that among the three LGUs that we studied, the municipality of Tanawan was the first Yolanda hit local government unit to submit a completed rehabilitation plan to the national government. Its LGU designated sectorial focal persons to coordinate relief efforts and the system allowed coordination and assignments of relief efforts on rebuilding across barangays. So what were the impact of interventions, of these various interventions of different governance actors on human security and resilience of different areas? Some international agencies were able to provide short-term employment. However, the problem now is how to sustain livelihood opportunities for many of the Yolanda areas. Some barangays still complain about food scarcity, either because they do not have the money to buy food or the place where they are staying, particularly in some resettlement areas, are very far from places like the sea and the farms to source food and livelihood. New infrastructure projects like barangay health centers have been set up in some areas, but access to health services and insurance like affordable medicine is still an issue in many areas, especially in resettlement areas. Some sectors like the elderly and the persons with disabilities need more assistance in this particular area. Safe housing, particularly in relocation areas and on-site areas, is still an important issue. We also noted that many individuals and communities still suffer from a number of vulnerabilities. Many of them complained about lack of sustainable livelihood, inadequate and unsafe housing, and at the same time also we noted that some of the areas, the resettlement areas, were very prone to flooding, and according to our contacts from UP Tacloban, the areas are often flooded by the past few typhoons in the past few years. There is also inadequate provision of utilities such as water and electricity, and incomplete infrastructure such as roads and drainage in the resettlement areas. The capacity to protect themselves, their families, and communities from future disasters and day-to-day safety issues remain tenuous in many cases. However, some agencies that remained have been giving a number of barangays trainings in the RRM, budgeting, and planning. And for a short time, foreign and international agencies replaced local and national patrons as communities become heavily dependent on them. So in terms of, let me go to my conclusions because of time constraints. Both national and local governance mechanisms and programs in the RRM have not been adequate for Yolanda's impact. While significant and comprising majority of interventions during the relief phase and in a limited sense in the recovery phase, the assistance from international and national non-state actors have not addressed most of the human security concerns of people as well as resilience in the three areas that we went through. There were questions about the priorities of these aid agencies, duplication of aid, and whether they took into consideration the inputs and the actual needs of the people and communities affected. In some cases, they replicated the patron-client relations. It is also the nature of aid that it is only temporary. Some aid agencies' mandate is only in the relief phase and not in the reconstruction and development phase. So in terms of lessons learned moving forward, we need stronger national and local disaster frameworks where we could see more improved coordination with national and local governments in the lead in terms of identification, distribution, and prioritization of appropriate aid. National government agencies need more capacity building. Capacity building is also needed among local governments and the various stakeholders at the local government level, particularly civil society organizations and local communities. There's a need for community empowerment and localization so that when interventions come, they know what to do and what people need. People have plans, and people were the ones who crafted these plans and programs for disaster. And we also need a more strengthened international coordination and response, not only at the UN level, but also at the ASEAN level, particularly since we already have an existing ASEAN agreement for disaster management and emergency response. I think we have more to talk about right after the Q&A. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much to Professor Ella Atienza for that concise yet comprehensive presentation. So she talked about the importance of effective and efficient coordination, not just between national and local governments, but also with international and local NGOs, also having well-capacitated national government agencies and local government units, and the importance of having well-empowered communities so they can play an active role in recovery and resiliency efforts. Yes, we will have more time to talk about and to unpack the study of Dr. Ella, Professor Ella, during the open forum. And if you have any questions, do send them in by typing them on using the Q&A button of Zoom. And for those who are watching us on Facebook, you are very much welcome to participate in the discussion. Just type your question in the comment section. So at this point, let us tackle another important topic, which is this disaster financing. It's a crucial aspect of DRRM as it addresses the fiscal impacts and economic losses from natural hazards and supports communities and countries to increase their resilience to disasters. And to enlighten us about this topic is Mr. Novel Bangsal. He's the Executive Director of the Budget and Tax Research Bureau of the Congressional Planning and Congressional Policy and Budget Research Department of the House of Representatives. E.D. Bangsal has written several publications on public finance, social protection, agricultural development, and institutional and constitutional reforms. He finished his Master of Arts in Development Economics from the UP School of Economics and his Master of Arts in Public Administration from the UP National College of Public Administration and Governance. He also has a diploma in public management from the Development Academy of the Philippines. E.D. Novel Bangsal, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Sheila. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon to everyone. I would like to thank PIDS, PIDS, especially to Dr. Orbeta and to Sheila, and to our SERP-P network for this opportunity. I would like to focus my discussion on the fiscal response of government to natural disasters in the context of the disaster risk financing and insurance, or DRFI. My point in this presentation are based on a policy paper that we prepared on the same subject. This is available on the CPBRD and SERP-P website, and also from our recent engagement with the World Bank and key House leaders in relation to the proposed amendments to House Bill 5889 or the Disaster Resilience Act last 18th Congress. Next slide, please. Okay. Weather-related catastrophic disasters, let me also add health-related public crises have increased in frequency and their economic impact have become more costly over time. And if you're going to look at the slide, about 60% of total land area and close to 74% of total population are exposed to multiple natural hazards. And based on the catastrophe risk modeling, the average annual loss to public and private assets caused by earthquakes and typhoon has been estimated to be about 176.6 billion, and of which earthquake accounts for 43.5 billion and tropical cyclone about 133.2 billion. So what does this tell us? This tells us that the public sector must improve its budget response capacity in the aftermath of a disaster. I think Dr. Atienza mentioned this, and the lessons from Yolanda tells us how important is our fiscal response to natural disasters, and to be able to manage volatility on the fiscal side. And just to tell you, of course, how much the cost of the fiscal response to natural disasters, especially when hit by the same magnitude such as Yolanda. So the government's reliance on ex-post resources, especially on budget allocation and other instruments that do not require advanced planning, puts the management of fiscal resources to increase instability and uncertainty. But ex-ante disaster risk financing and insurance can facilitate better fiscal management of disaster risk because it anticipates potential budgetary impacts and plans ahead to ensure adequate financial capacity and quick release of funds. Specifically, National Disaster Trust Fund, which is the subject of this presentation, can be used to secure advanced financing of disaster costs, especially reconstruction operations. Next slide, please. Okay, to develop a effective DRFI strategy, there are certain elements or numbers of consideration that that need to be taken account. So first is the time dimension. So as you can see in the slide, different phases of the post-disaster intervention, meaning relief, recovery, and reconstruction, entails different time dimension. So, and also, of course, the resource requirement needed to respond to this specific phases. So the timelines of post-disaster phases, well, for example, while immediate resources will be needed to support relief operations, the bulk of funds will only be required several months later when the actual reconstruction program starts. So as you can see, the time element in terms of the reconstruction accounts for usually the longest time to attend to. And if you look at the resource requirement, it's also the highest among the different phases of post-disaster intervention. So again, we have to consider the time dimensions in terms of post-disaster requirement. Next slide, please. So another element that need to be considered is the cost of financial instruments. So the cost of financial instrument differs depending on the cost of capital. In this case, the cost multiplier is defined as the ratio of the cost of financial product and the expected payout of the financial product. And the second is the rate of disbursement. How long does the release or the processing and release of the funds out of these financial instruments? And third is the amount of funds that each instrument can provide. Okay, for instance, foreign aid, in this case, donor support, either in relief or recovery, may be cheap capital, but disbursement to the government often takes several months. Another major source of post-disaster funds are the reserves or savings of government. These funds are cheap capital, and the disbursement can be quick as these funds are already available. However, the amount of money are usually limited. On the other hand, the use of risk transfer instruments, these are usually instruments that transfer risk to a third party, such as insurance, can provide large amount of funds but can be relatively costly. Depending on the type of insurance, disbursement rates can be quick in the case of parametric insurance, or lengthy in the case of traditional indemnity-based insurance. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, these are sources of disaster financing. So as you can see, the slide presents different instruments for ex-post and ex-ante financing that government can use to mobilize funding after a disaster. It also provides an assessment of the time necessary to disburse the funds. More or less, the advantage of ex-ante instruments is that these are secured before a disaster, and thus allows for quick disbursement. Of course, quick disbursement character of ex-ante instruments like parametric insurance also has a cost. Next slide, please. And third element of in coming up with an effective DRFI strategy is the risk layering. So the immediate and long-term fiscal impact of natural disasters depend on the nature and the severity of each event and the disaster risk financing instrument that is available to the government. So an effective DRFI strategy applies a three-tiered risk-layered approach to cover for residual risks that cannot be mitigated. So the layered approach moves from lower, intermediate, and higher layers of risk that correspond to various degrees of disaster frequency and severity. So as you can see from the slide, the lesser frequency as well as the greater severity of the impact entails high risk disaster, and this also entails certain risk instruments, what they refer to as risk transfers, such as in this case the parametric insurance or cat bonds. But again, this also entails a certain level of cost. So again, looking at this risk layering strategy tells us that government should consider different types or a mix of fiscal instruments that need to be applied to respond fiscally to natural disasters. So it's important that we try to leverage our risk and spread it to different risk transfer or risk retention instruments. Okay. Okay. Next slide, please. So basically, in terms of DFRI practice in the Philippines, there are already existing DFRI instruments that cover various risks, and this include the NDRIM Fund and the Local Disaster Risk Management Fund. In this case, as you can see, the risk layer entails is very low. And you also have contingent credit lines, an example of which is the World Bank that offered a contingent credit line, or what they refer to as the development policy loan with catastrophe deferred drawback option, or basically a CATBAN. In November 2019, the World Bank issued 2 tranches of cat bonds with insurance coverage of maximum of $225 million for 3 years. So the process was the Philippines pays for the insurance premium for the coverage, of course, with the cost, which the World Bank transfers to cat bond investors. Another and last DRFI instruments that is currently being practiced at the moment in the country is the GSIS indemnity-based insurance for higher layers of risk. Again, based on the law, the property, specifically the property insurance law, requires every government unit, except municipal governments below first class, to ensure its properties consistent with the provisions of the property insurance fund. So the National Disaster or the NDRIM Fund or the NDRIM law provides, I think Dr. Atienza also mentioned this, that provides already much of the legal basis for disaster risk intervention. In this case, disaster risk financing insurance. So the law has provisions with respect to the calamity funds, which are funded through the annual budget appropriations. A share equal to 30% of both the NDRIM Fund and the Local Disaster Risk Management Fund are to be allocated to a Quick Response Fund, or QRF, or a standby fund for relief and recovery programs. And at the local level, the law also allows for any unspent local disaster risk management resource fund to be rolled over at the end of the fiscal year and accrue to a special trust fund up to 5 years. So for the LDRMF to be used for the purchase of insurance coverage and for local governments to transfer their unexpected funds to other LGUs. So again, if you look at the legal framework, more or less there is already a legal basis for both national government and local government to adopt DRFI. However, the critical gap of the law is that it provides a piecemeal and disjointed approach to overall DRFI management. It does not integrate both risk retention and risk transfer instruments as part of an overall DRFI strategy. So what is needed is an integrated approach that will combine, as I was saying, emphasizing earlier, the use of various risk transfer instruments or risk retention instruments based on the risk profile, the fiscal position of the government, as well as the prevailing market conditions. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, considering all the policy gaps that I was mentioning, the DOF formulated a national DRFI strategy in 2015 that is rooted in a risk layering strategy, as I shown earlier. So as you can see, the strategy is composed of risk financing instruments that provide financial protection for disasters of different frequencies and severities. Again, in view of the COVID pandemic outbreak, this strategy can be expanded to cover other shocks and government risk planning to include pandemic risk and not only natural disaster risk. I just would like to point out an item here. There's a new national indemnity insurance program included in that strategy, which is still under preparation to improve insurance protection for higher risk national government assets. Later on, I'll be mentioning to you why this particular program is still under preparation. So again, it is possible to explore new financing sources for catastrophe risk insurance programs, given this type of strategy to respond to pandemic risks as well as other natural hazards. Another element in this strategy is the asset data. That's the one at the bottom, the asset data and risk data. So incomplete data on public sector assets hinder efficient decision-making related to both financial and physical management. Again, that is why we have underinsurance problem of government assets because of this incomplete data on public sector assets. So government lacks access to complete data on all assets owned by national governments as well as LGUs. As a solution to that problem, the Bureau of Treasury established the National Asset Registry System, or the NARS, to provide a comprehensive inventory of non-financial assets of the government. The inventory initially gathered by the BTR included school buildings of the DepEd, roads and bridges of the DPWH. Note that the asset data registry needs to be scaled up to cover all government entities, not as I was mentioning. What is covered at the moment are DepEd assets as well as DPWH assets. That is why the National Indemnity Insurance Program for national government, as I was mentioning earlier on, have yet to be launched because of the issue of the need to scale up to cover all the government entities in the registry. Okay, so overall, the national DRF strategy, however, still lacks legal support. So there's no law nor legislation existing at the moment to operationalize this strategy. Next slide, please. Okay, just to add more dimension to the discussion of the disadvantages of having to rely heavily on exposed disaster risk financing. So one issue is, well, two key issues actually are worth mentioning in this regard. One is the uncertainty and inefficiency in the levels of the NDRIM fund and the inefficiency in the fund access. As you can see in the table, the table shows the volatile trend of NDRIM fund from 2018 to 2022. Also, the level of unutilized budget for NDRIM fund remains problematic. As you can see, the total unreleased appropriation for 2019 and 2020 was at 6.9 billion and 5.3 billion respectively. In fact, if I were to mention about the Yolanda, I think in 2016 of 38 billion NDRIM fund was allocated in 2016. 38 billion. Then in 2015, it went down to 15.7 billion, which was 146 lower than the 26 budget. Just to highlight the volatility or variability of the budget allocation level for NDRIM fund. And the second one is the inefficient operation of the fund. Next slide, please. The second issue, drawback, is to expose DRF is the inefficiency in fund access. So the efficient operation of the fund is hampered by the lengthy process of approval and release of funds to recipients, including LGUs, which can take from months to years. This situation creates impediments to the recovery and reconstruction process. For instance, lack of knowledge or clarity in the documents required by the submitting entity, the need for validation of the damage and evaluation of the submitted request, the need to review the NDRMC recommendation by the Office of the President, or the process of release of funds from the DBM can all exacerbate the operations of the NDRIM fund. Next slide, please. Okay, so among the best practices on fiscal risk management, a natural or national disaster trust fund is one good example. Natural disaster trust fund can be used to establish a fiscal buffer to cover the potential cost of a catastrophic event in a timely manner without engendering long-term fiscal sustainability. So the experience of Mexico in the DRFI management with its core structure, the Fund for Natural Disasters, or what they call as FONDEN, provides a good example of a balanced strategy that builds upon a risk layering approach, different ex-ante financial instruments that can be used in combination to cover different risk layers based on the frequency, severity of the expected events. So the key features of the FONDEN, let me just cite a few of them. In terms of the fund allocation, no less than 0% of the federal budget is allocated to natural disasters to be managed by FONDEN. This is through legislation, so that 0.4% of the federal budget is around roughly about 800 million US dollars. So this guarantees, let me just highlight, this guarantees a preset level each year because it is through legislation, unlike funding levels of the NDRIM fund, which suffers variability. Another important feature of the structure is the resources are managed as a trust in the National Development Bank and can roll over year to year. So the annual budget allocations accrue to a trust, thus allowing reserves to grow in long term. In contrast to the Philippines, any unspent amounts in the NDRIM fund at the end of the fiscal year reverts back to the general fund. And another one is FONDEN can pay through 3 windows, but the majority of funds is spent on reconstruction. In the current setup in the NDRIM fund, priorities compete for funding. fund then allows for certainty that funding will be channeled to both prevention and reconstruction, because there are specific windows that is specifically dedicated to the release and transfer of funds to for specific purposes, whether it be prevention or reconstruction. Fund then finances 100% of the damage to public assets for federal assets and 50% of the damage to subnational assets. Okay, so basically that's the feature of the Fund and Resource Fund. Next slide, please. Okay, assuming that we adopt such structure, National Disaster Trust Fund structure here, there are possible scenarios that need to be considered. One, of course, is where to source the fund. So there are a number of possible sources for funding for the trust fund. So in this case, I've cited two budgetary instruments which are commonly used to build fiscal buffers to cover the cost of natural disasters. And these are the contingency reserves, or the contingent fund, and the natural disaster funds. In this case, the interim fund. So the recent use of the President's contingent fund was to help prevent the spread of the African swine fever in the country. So proposed application for CF were also raised to prevent COVID-19 outbreak in the country. So and the adjusted appropriation for the contingent fund in 2021 was at 18.7 billion. So clearly, the contingent fund constitute a small fraction of the total public expenditure and are limited relative to the cost associated with natural disasters. Another source possible, of course, is the interim fund, the annual appropriation for interim fund, which can be converted as the funding source for the National Disaster Trust Fund. So as I have cited, the levels of appropriation to the interim fund is relatively comparable with what was required or being required in the Fonden's allocation for Mexico. For example, from 2015 to 2018, the average share of interim fund to total national government spending was about 0.76%, or if net of debt service is around 0.86%. So basically, it's within the threshold requirement for disaster trust funds requirement. Next slide, please. Okay, so another element to consider, of course, is the size of this fiscal buffers. As I was saying earlier, international experience indicate, while they indicate varied level of contingency reserves appropriations in order to deal with fiscal risk associated with natural disasters. But in most cases, the size of fiscal buffers range from 0.03 to 2% of total government spending. So more or less, if you look at the proposal earlier about the sources of financing, interim fund and the contingent fund can more or less provide the necessary fiscal space to be able to operationalize such concept. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to discuss briefly some of the key features of the trust fund. One is the budget and financial accounts. As you can see, the trust fund will be comprised of a number of accounts for specific applications such as reconstruction, risk transfers, etc. So the budget for reconstruction provides resources for rehabilitation, reconstruction of uninsured and uninsured public assets. So the second element is cost-sharing arrangement. So it's important to encourage LGUs to take financial ownership of their exposure and help reduce their disaster losses. So the contribution of local government may differ by sector, type of assets, type of severity or of disaster, and budget constraints of the local government. So in Mexico, the fund then finances 50% of the recovery, reconstruction costs for eligible uninsured local assets for the first time it is damaged by natural disaster, and the remaining 50% is financed by the local government. And lastly, the institutional structure the proposed institutional structure should allow for an integrated approach to the DRFI management, unlike today, which is a disjointed approach. So many agencies providing different interventions. So a specialized coordination unit should be able to keep track of all allocated funds and associated recovery and reconstruction activities. It should manage the efforts between the central and local government as well as the private sector. So this coordination unit may be within the proposed DDR, or the Department of Disaster Resilience, or in the Department of Finance. Next slide, please. Okay, just very briefly, just would like to cite the efforts we've done, the CPBRD, our office, in coordination with the World Bank, to come up with a proposed specific amendment to House Bill number 5889. So the identified proposed amendment, mainly in Article 14, which is entitled Disaster Risk Transfer and Insurance of the bill, highlight the need for a coordinated and evidence-based efforts in managing disaster risk financing and insurance based on global good practices. And just to cite a very important features of this amendment is, of course, one is the consideration to consider establishing a long-term disaster trust fund that can ensure more efficient management of DRFI, as well as the laying out of cost-sharing arrangement with respect to DRFI mechanism and instruments, and authority and discretion to be given to the Department of Disaster Resilience in coordination with DBM and DOF to mandate lower levels of government, LGUs specifically, to ensure financial protection of their own assets against various risks. So finally, in conclusion, I just would like to mention just a few important elements when considering the proposal of a National Disaster Trust Fund. So it has its own benefits. However, this type of funds is that they are kept outside the usual budget process and follow different allocation rules. If the financial management and governance procedure of these funds are not carefully designed, national disaster trust funds can undermine fiscal discipline and transparency. So on that point, I would like to thank PIDS and SERP-P Network, and I look forward to more discussion after these presentations. Thank you, Sheila.
Thank you very much, Executive Director Novel Bangsal of the CPBRD. He just explained to us the importance of having an ex-ante disaster risk financing instrument, and we have heard from him the possible scenarios if we are to consider a national disaster trust fund for the Philippines. And as he mentioned, the beauty of this approach is that this approach will help secure advanced financing of disaster costs in the country, in contrast with existing disaster risk financing strategies, which rely mainly on budget appropriations.
Yes, that's true.
Thank you, ED Novel. So we will hear more from him during the open forum. So if you have questions about his presentation, just type your question using the comment section if you're on Facebook, and using the Q&A button if you are on Zoom. Okay, our last presentation will help us understand the payments for ecosystem services, a mechanism that has been in the law and in the policy discourse for quite some time, yet its implementation is somewhat sketchy. This is a PIDS study done by the team of Dr. Sonny Domingo, Ms. R.B. Joy Manihar, and Mr. John Okbina. And to present the paper is Dr. Domingo, a senior research fellow at PIDS, who has more than 3 decades of extensive multi-sector technical and policy research exposure in agricultural research and development and extension, natural resource management, and disaster risk reduction and management. And as mentioned earlier by Dr. Orbeta, he is our in-house DRRM specialist here at PIDS. Dr. Domingo is a member of the technical committee of the Philippine Agriculture and Fisheries Biotechnology Program and a member of the Council of Fellows of the Philippine Public Safety College. His current research interests include ecological integrity and environmental policy, technical agriculture and resource economics, and climate change and disaster risk management. He obtained his bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of the Philippines, Los Baños, and his Doctor of Philosophy in Applied Economics from the Orange campus of Charles Sturt University in Australia, as a fellow of the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research. Dr. Domingo, Sonny, the floor is now yours.
Okay, thank you, Sheila. So let me share my screen. Okay, as mentioned by Sheila, this presentation is based on a work we did last year, focusing on payments for ecosystem services, looking at how to better manage our natural resources. For this purpose, since it's a very thematically specific month, we are relating the presentation to DRRM and climate change adaptation and management. So the title for this afternoon's presentation is Payment for Ecosystem Services for Climate Change and Disaster Risk Management in the Philippines. The work, as mentioned by Sheila, was done with Ms. Harvey Manihar as well as Mr. John Ocpina. So the outline of the presentation is as follows. I'll be going through some details as regards our challenges when we face disaster events in the country, as well as how we look at climate change related risks in our local landscapes. Disaster impact estimates, we go into the need for proper loss and damage accounting. We discuss the issue in terms of DRRM planning and budgeting, institutional platform and action, fiscal management. So very much related to what our previous presenters conveyed earlier. So Dr. Ella went into the details as regards our interventions post Yolanda, and Director Bangsal elaborated on fiscal management related issues. My presentation would bridge those two presentations and possibly in the end discuss a more novel approach in sustaining our financing for DRR related and climate change and adaptation mitigation related initiatives. So the second section of the presentation will focus on the payment for ecosystem services for climate change and disaster risk mitigation and adaptation. And then we go into the key takeaways from the study and from related studies focusing on DRR and CC. And then we try to recommend ways to move forward. So as a backdrop, environment degradation or related issues increase climate change and anthropogenic risks. So such include both natural and man-induced related disaster events. Ecosystem condition declines by at least 4% per decade from the UN. This is alarming, especially in the Philippines, when we look at ecological integrity related concerns. The Philippines tops most of the indices risk-wise that we have. And specifically in 2022, among 190 countries, we were on the top spot with regard to the computed disaster risk index. So we have extensive damages and casualties from disaster events. And unfortunately, relating that to environment anchored markets, we have inefficient markets on ecological environmental services provision, making PES probably a good option moving forward for alternative approaches, when we want to have sustained interventions both at the national and subnational levels. Okay, natural disaster wise, going through the years, the decades and decades of exposure to natural hazards, we see a lot of hydromet related events impacting local populations. But relating that as well to climate change, it's not about the number or the frequency increasing. It's more of the intensity of such events increasing. For example, we've encountered, of course, Typhoon Haiyan in 2013, our first super typhoon. And then more recently, 2021, we had Odette, also impacting the southern Philippines. Last year, we had Paeng, also causing a lot of damages and casualties, also in Mindanao. So looking at what we've done historically to address such risk exposure, probably we have a lot of room for improvement. And I think such would support the presentation earlier by Dr. Elton. So also, if you're going to look at evidences or numbers, you see on your screen the biggest numbers damage-wise coming from hydromet-related events in the country. So that's for the numbers that we've got for the past century or so. And that brings us into another concern. So we've admittedly encountered so many disaster events during the past century. Unfortunately, we have to admit that we have very poor accounting, short as well as long-term related economic impacts of disaster. Well, not only economic, but social, all the dimensions of impacts coming from both natural and man-induced disaster events. So we have short-run as well as long-run disaster impacts. If you look at short-run concerns, we see direct impacts on death, casualties, and destruction of property, disruption of productivity and product flows, so value chains, our supply systems, both at the national and subnational levels, decrease in short-term economic activity, including residual lags. In the long run, we see evidence varying across the different sectors. The evidence is also being diverse from the most positive, because there are beneficial effects of post-disaster interventions, as well as to the most adverse. But again, we do not collect routinely pre- and post-disaster data, which is a very big entry point for intervention. Intergenerational damages and impacts are not being looked at as well. And then the lesser seen benefit coming from post-disaster related activities, which is focusing on creative or innovative post-disaster improvements and growth. So the way we try to build better after a disaster event actually impacts not only the local level, but also the national dynamics growth-wise. So long-term human and economic losses much larger than immediate losses. And the World Bank and UN found that prevention spending is more effective than post-disaster spending. So we all know this. We need to invest on preparedness. We have to make our communities more resilient so that whenever disaster events happen, they will incur lesser losses. So we've seen over the years the national government as well as the local governments trying to improve the policy landscape. And we have shifted from us being responsive to proactive, provision-wise. Unfortunately, we also look at evidences over the years. Although we also have devolved so many functions to the local government, our institutional structures, the processes within those institutions, and the resulting actions, institution-wise, remain wanting. So we need to do more, not only in terms of what we see on the ground, but also in terms of strengthening the basis for such action. So in the screen, you see the national and subnational structure for the RR management. You see some policies that we've passed over the years to augment the provisions for disaster risk reduction management. We see as well evidences in terms of institutional action. Relating this presentation to Dr. Ella's presentation earlier, you see here the timeline for Yolanda related interventions post the November event. And then you see down below what we did for Odette, where we actually did not see so much improvement from what we did a decade ago for Yolanda. There is also evidence as regard suboptimal rebuilding processes for the man-induced Marawi disaster event in 2017. So 6 years after the Marawi siege, 10 years after the Yolanda event, what evidences of improvement, institutional action-wise, do we see right now? I think that's one of the questions that we have in the Q&A section of our Zoom. We have, I think, very weak inclusivity of national and subnational and sectoral decision-making, as well as budgeting processes. So in a few months, we'll be having our barangay elections. And unfortunately, we have thousands and thousands of barangays. They are the closest to communities in terms of governance. But with this very huge responsibility, does not come the required resources, and possibly the governance facility for them to do it. So we need augmentation there as well. At the municipal or city levels, they have to do more in terms of bringing in inputs coming from the barangays, coming from the communities in their crafting of development programs and plans, as well as in their decision-making and eventual budgeting. So Director Bangsal elaborated a lot on the fiscal side. So I won't be going into the details of the slide, but suffice it to say that we have a lot of sources for the RRM and climate change related interventions, funding-wise. So we have both national and subnational sources of funding. Now, on your slide, you see the subnational funding to the left and the national funding to the right. So I think Director Bangsal elaborated more on the NDRIMF, the National DRR Fund. To your left, you see the utilization rate for the local DRR fund. 5% of regular revenues from our local governments being put into an item specifically for disaster risk reduction management related expenses. 70% of that for mitigation related expenses, 30% for QRF, for quick response. And to the right, you see how we farm out the national level funding for the RRM coming from our national DRR fund. The SWD is the biggest recipient, followed by, you see here, DepEd, the PWH, institutions that are very much integrated in terms of our action post-disaster events. So the other DRR-related challenges are presented in the slide. Institutional leadership and subnational structure needing augmentation. Fiscal planning and budgeting also needing augmentation. Resource mobilization and procurement being articulated by our stakeholders as entry points for more efficient intervention. Funding sourcing and utilization, weak monitoring and evaluation, both of fund use and reporting, public participation and stakeholder representation, us trying to get closer to the communities that we serve, and for us to also see resilience among them. So that's DRRM in general. Now, if you look at the country, the previous presentation presents our key challenges moving forward, DRRM-wise. So we've flagged entry points institution-wise, entry points policy-wise, and entry points grounding-wise. So we have still a lot to do. And although years and years of encountering so much destruction coming from both natural and man-induced disasters should have made us better by now, it seems that we are not learning that much. And evidences show that we need to do a lot more institution-wise for us to better serve the population. So can PES, can Payment for Ecosystem Services support DRR, NCCA, or mitigation and adaptation-related initiatives in the country? I think the presentation earlier points to possibilities in terms of resources that we have to fund interventions, disaster risk reduction, as well as climate change adaptation mitigation-wise. So we've mentioned that we have a lot of sources, but we've also mentioned that we have very inefficient ways of mobilizing and using such. So for example, the National DRR Fund shows us around 70 to 80% utilization rate. The local DRR Fund shows us around 40% utilization rate on average. So very inefficient way of using what we have right now for DRR-related interventions. And that's counterintuitive, since we've been saying that we need more and more resources to put into DRR-related interventions. Diba? May pera tayo, but we are not using such right now. So we need to do a lot. And then probably a fresher look at this is to involve more our stakeholders, the communities. And I guess PES is one way of doing that. So this is a more novel way for us to engage stakeholders, allow them to participate more, not only in terms of processes and decision-making, but also in terms of them grounding initiatives on the ground. So what are ecosystem services? We classify them as provisioning services, regulating services, cultural services, support services, ranging from products to recreation, for example, for cultural services, to regulating services. So we can have a fresher way to address the key points, or the key entry points for intervention, DRRM and climate change and adaptation mitigation ones. So we just elaborate more on what these provisioning, regulating, supporting, and cultural services are, from food, water, fuel, fiber, to aesthetics, educational, recreational. So we look at as well possibilities of the tourism sector contributing to local resource management, to local mitigation and adaptation related initiatives. So earnings from such, or money coming from such, going into efforts toward better resilient communities. So for those who are not very much aware of the definition of PES, we have it here. 2005, Wonder defines PES as a voluntary transaction in which an environmental service is bought by buyer from a minimum of one provider, if and only if the provider continues to provide that service. So that's the conditionality. I think Muradian in 2010 considers a broader way of the application of PES as a concept. So PES as a transfer of resource between social actors, which aims to create incentives to align individuals and or collective land use decisions with the social interest in the management of resources. So I think this is, in a way, very much applicable to what we are seeing right now in the country, PES application. Traditionally, we need to see voluntary transaction. We need to see a well-defined ecosystem service being traded, buyers, sellers, and of course, the conditionality. But what we have right now, I guess, are PES-like schemes being adopted by our stakeholders. So what are the motivations for our actors? For sellers, of course, natural capital protection, IPs, our indigenous peoples continue traditional practices within their domains, local communities to have other sources of livelihood. For buyers, for those who want those ecosystem services, access to ecological services, may those be pertaining to water supply, aesthetic values, entertainment, recreation, access to natural capital, or for them to actually disincentivize wrong practices or non-compliance on policy. So we need as well very strong intermediaries. Knowledge building and management would be some of the preferred returns coming from our intermediaries. Shared goals and interests, proper resource stewardship, and policy compliance. What are the enabling conditions? We have those here. Trust and transparency, capacity to pay and provide service from parties, influential champion as intermediary, well-defined boundaries, baseline data, government structure, clear purpose addressing threats or risks. So we also need a lot for PES schemes or arrangements to work. And it's quite difficult to be very much aligned to the traditional definition, needing voluntary action. So what we see right now in the country are systems with lesser voluntary action, but more of those asking the population or stakeholders to shell out money. May those be as fees, as payments, for environmental related services. So as I mentioned, we have PES arrangements, which are traditional in terms of system and coverage, and then PES-like arrangements, those needing more ingredients for them to be called a traditional PES arrangement. For example, those having absences of voluntary transaction and the conditionality requirements. So comparison of PES components in terms of what we have in literature, PES payment schemes, public-private partnership, and then we have from our case studies also added here quasi-public, because there are entities operating within the bureaucracy that are supposedly part of government, but they are operating semi-government in terms of character. And then buyer-seller configuration, one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-one, many-to-many, ES packaging, bundling, layering, and piggybacking. Piggybacking, we also added in this slide because we see environmental services that are actually being offered free from our supposed providers of service, because they are part of the larger scheme of things. So buyers, sellers, providers, intermediaries, I'll just go through very quickly. PS actors and design. Tiers in terms of payment category, as you see. A lot of what we have right now started with studies to peg initial costs of transactions through willingness to pay studies. Such are trial and error, and eventually they move or progress with them setting other figures in terms of fees and costs. Some do simulation modeling, and specifically those with a bit limited on-site information. And then site-specific quantitative measurements, action monitoring, possible payments can be done per unit for those with much more information or data from specific areas. As I mentioned earlier, we based our presentation on several case studies. So we looked at what we are seeing right now with Subic, the Subic Metropolitan Freeport Zone. We also looked at the arrangements for the Tubataha Reef Natural Park. And then we engaged with our stakeholders from the Puerto Princesa Subterranean River Natural Park as well. So you see here a very concise presentation of what we can expect PAS application-wise. So PES packaging, piggybacking, layering for some of them. Then possibly us comparing what we are doing now with our neighbor, no? In this case, Vietnam. So buyers of services could be your local households, tourists, and possibly companies trying to get something from the local population. Sellers, government actors, no? Indigenous peoples, local population as well, local communities providing services. Intermediaries, those providing oversight. Government, both at the national and subnational level. INGOs, including in this case for Tubataha, WWF. We have as well NGAs, DNR, LGUs, and certain committees for our global counterpart. And in the end, probably in all our case studies, we weren't able to see very traditional approaches to PES application. So a lot of them are PES like. Aside from our case studies, we also see a lot of local grounding of PES. For example, you go to Negros Occidental, you see applications in San Carlos City, in Bago City, in Mountain Province in the north, from the municipality of Bauco, in the southern Philippines as well, Misamis Oriental, Cagayan de Oro City. So we have a lot of local applications of PES. More novel way for us to source financing for local initiatives. We just have to have very interested parties, no? Both the seller of ecosystem service and then the buyer who are willing to pay, as well as, of course, our oversight, the intermediary, which can be government or an outside entity from government. So very quickly as well, our case studies, Subic Bay, Freeport Zone, inception 1992, start of PES 2014. So if you go to Subic, you check in one of their hotels, you will see from the charge slip an environmental fee. That's usually around 100. So that money goes into a fund that they use for local natural resource management. If you go to Palawan, Puerto Princesa Underground River, you see, I think, a very well sustained operation, also coming from a PES-like arrangement. So you have buyers, which possibly are your local public or tourists from both local and international origin. Sellers of the environmental service coming from your IPs. So they are earning a lot. The local communities are augmenting their livelihoods because of a PES-like arrangement. In the process, sustaining local management initiatives and maintaining the ecological integrity of the area. The same is true with Tubataha. So this was actually initiated with WWF, and they set an initial fee based on a study, a willingness to pay study, but then eventually moves the amount given what they were seeing on field. So this is an arrangement that is also quasi-government in nature because like what we have in Puerto Princesa, the Tubataha reef management is also supposedly part of government, but they are operating on a semi-government character capacity. So just relating again to what we want to see traditionally for PES, we don't see voluntary transaction from our case study sites, and there is that item of conditionality also being a concern. But these are PES-like arrangements, and probably it's a way for us to have systems that are locally appropriate for them to be more sustainable, functioning-wise, and for them to actually be viable in so many dimensions. So just to organize our thoughts with regard to arrangements that we see from our case study sites. So you have your buyers, you have your sellers, and you have your intermediaries. The intermediaries may be non-government actors. They may be from the government, from the national government agencies, as well as LGUs. They may be international development organizations. And in the end, those who provide the ecosystem services are also possibly coming from the communities, local stakeholders, volunteers, government and quasi-government entities, non-government organizations. And those paying may be coming from your local tourists, general public, fisheries, and other patrons. So a system that is quite possibly easy to grasp, but very difficult to ground. For something like this to be sustainable, you need to check a lot of boxes. So what are the learnings that we've seen from our case studies locally? PES is a good platform for financial and operational sustainability. So we are seeing the underground river ecosystem being managed well because of PS-like related schemes. We are seeing the proper management of Tubataha Reef because of a PES-like arrangement. Country lacks a definitive national policy and framework on PES, but enabling provisions are lodged in several policies. Active engagement and collaboration with IPs and local communities increases onboarding, ownership among communities with PES-like arrangements going forward. Private and CSO NGO support facilitate self-sustaining arrangements without government resource. So PS or PS-like arrangements can move forward outside government or bureaucratic oversight. Legal basis instrumental in enforcing conditionality need to be strengthened. There are arbitrary bases for fee setting and fees. So pricing or cost-wise, we need to have a way to standardize PS-related interventions or schemes. Weak legal enforcement towards damages, no standard compensation blueprint. Agreements fall through without appropriate performance metrics, and such compromise the stability and sustainability of PS-like arrangements. What are the other key takeaways? There are a lot of negotiation bottlenecks because you have to have a meeting of the mind between your sellers of ES-related services or ecosystems-related services and your sellers and your buyers from the other end. And such is facilitated by a very strong intermediary. May that be government or an entity outside the bureaucracy. Management and fiscal limitations. So we have a lot. Complementation and capacity building in initiatives, government accounting, auditing rules, and PS payment restructuring. So this is a concern for some because we are dealing with money. And how do you account for that or audit that? You bring it in the public system. Transparency and monitoring and evaluation checks. So if you're also dealing with resources, with money, you need to be very transparent and you need to have so many checks. Facilitation of buyer and seller interaction is also very much required. Missing policies and institutions, looking at PES. So we have a lot of actually local policies that touch a bit on PES-related schemes, but we need a broader set of provisions that would allow us to institutionalize or mainstream PES within our systems as an alternative option for sustainable finance. So weak sustainability measures, data unavailability, evolving definition of PES as well, which is very good. That's why we actually conducted the PES study. We wanted to have a basis for us to say that this is PES, that this is PES-like, and there are entry points for improvements as such. So we are in the process of trying to evolve from the very traditional PES definition to a more locally applicable or nationally applicable version of such. Other ways forward, capitalize on evolving PES definition and increased interest from government and outside stakeholders. So not only the government looking at PES, but also our extra government counterparts being very much interested in PES-related schemes for operational sustainability. And I guess the recent PDP that we have, the Philippine Development Plan of the current administration, also touches on PES as an alternative modality. Replicate success, PES and ecotourism with natural capital management and ecological integrity initiatives. link PES to natural capital management and DRR CCA, CCM efforts, augment accounting and auditing policy to reflect PES and natural capital accounts, institute PES transparency platform and data management, explore performance-based M&E, incentivize mitigation adaptation shift from dole-out grants, user-based to exchange-based approaches like PES. Increase buy-in of the private sector for them to actually shell out resources for that arrangement. Study sustainable financing schemes, clear transaction and opportunity costs, frame sustainable PES templates, and pursue legal platform for PES and NGA at the national and subnational levels. So a big concern is the voluntary versus compliance payment that we are seeing from local PES-like arrangements. Voluntary being absent in so many of those arrangements. And I think this is the last slide. Payment for ecosystem services as a fiscally viable and sustainable scheme for DRR, CCA, and mitigation and initiatives may be considered as an alternative approach for us to have better funded, more fiscally sustainable initiatives on the ground. So with that, we thank you for listening.
And thank you very much, Dr. Sonny Domingo, for that enlightening presentation on payments for ecosystem services, or PES. Well, he presented to us several local examples, and through these examples, we can consider PES as a novel way of supporting local financing of natural resource management initiatives, which can help in DRRM and CCA efforts. But as what Dr. Domingo mentioned, the challenge now is how to institutionalize the PES and move away from traditional arrangements towards more, more proactive, less of the required and more voluntary ways, in which you incentivize the sellers. So we can talk more about the PES during our open forum. So thank you very much again, Sonny. So at this point, we have come to the next part of our virtual forum, which is the panel discussion and open forum. And so let me go through some of the questions in our chat box. We received a number of interesting questions. So at this point, may I ask our speakers to turn on your videos so our audience can see you as you answer the questions. And we have one here from, okay, this one is for Prof. Ella from from Asterio Olandia. So Doc Ella, do you have updates, if any, regarding the 5 lessons you mentioned since so 2013 we had the Yolanda. So after a decade, have you seen any changes? Have you seen any improvements? Okay. Have those lessons been have the issues been addressed? And he added that please note that today's attendees rated the readiness at 2.3. Remember, we had a poll. Yes. Or less than the expected value. And if you have any data, or if you have any follow-up study that you did, or perhaps if there is no follow-up study based on your observation and based on your readings. Okay. So go ahead, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the question. The last time we were in our case areas was actually pre-pandemic 2018. We had a validation workshop where different stakeholders were present. We presented our findings, and some of them, and I think this is the same point being stressed by Dr. Domingo earlier, there are actually a number of barangays and one municipality that has actually improved their response and their readiness. They said that they have learned their lesson from Yolanda and they know now what to do. They have benefited from the capacity building given to them by different agencies. So they use these resources to help people when they receive the news. They know what to do and they evacuate. They have built better systems for evacuation and how groups are able to develop. At the same time, to get away from the political alliances and rivalries among political elites, they use their own networks to try to see, not to rely so much. They also know that government funding is not unlimited. So even if they are allies with whoever is the governor or the president, they know that they cannot always rely on that. So if they establish linkages with the private sector, with CSOs, and there are actually one learning or improvement came from international NGOs themselves, who said that they have realized that localization, capacity building, these are more important rather than simply giving them things that the INGOs or even the national NGOs think are important for them. So some of the existing and surviving livelihood programs since the beginning of interventions survived because these were the ones where people have participated actively, and they were the ones who actually defined that they need these types of livelihood opportunities. But definitely, there are still a lot of areas that need more assistance. And a more recent paper I did with another colleague was comparing how recovery in Yolanda and in Marawi are failing, and the issue of livelihood and how adequate housing remain very important, and particularly in terms of building resilient resettlement areas that can not only provide livelihood but can also be resilient against future disasters. And there's also a lot of discontent on the part of a lot of people who have been promised a lot by government, and at the same time they said that they've gone through several administrations already, but things have not improved that much. But I would like to highlight also that there are areas where there are improvements because there's a confluence of a number of elements. You have local government units that are willing to learn, listen to the people. You have people demanding accountability and trying to participate in the making of plans, and they have partner private sector, universities, and NGOs aside from government that can also facilitate this efforts to make more resilient communities and local government. So the task is, how do we replicate these best practices, and other communities can also learn from them, and in the process also encourage new leaders and capacitate new leaders to take on many of these responsibilities, and knowing where to get help when needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ella. Yes, Sonny, please go ahead. I know that you have had you have researched a lot about disasters and natural hazards. So please.
Thanks, Sheila. Thanks, Dr. Atienza, for that responses here. I was actually in Yolanda damaged communities early this year, and I was able to see the most recent progress, rebuilding wise. So I guess what Dr. Atienza relayed is correct in so many ways. but we also see a lot of entry points for betterment.
Yeah.
For example, looking at what you have in Tanawan later,
Yeah.
you have two villages that are, I guess, very good examples of rebuilding, community rebuilding. So you have the SOS village, you have the Gawat Kalinga village, which are very good examples of permanent shelters that are not only relevant, but I think that are very much attractive to local residents for them to transfer there and actually live there. You know? But you go further from Tacloban and you see a lot of supposed resettlements, shelters that are not conducive for family life, you know, especially for those who were living before near the coasts. So a lot of entry points for us to do better. And you see the same issues with Marawi rehabilitation. I was also there early this year, and shelter-related issues dominate local concerns now. For example, even temporary shelters right now are still being occupied by local residents, but they are, I think, being forced out because of lease-related issues. So we need to do better post-disaster rehabilitation recovery-wise. No, we want to see us doing more progressively, not only policy, but also in terms of institutional grounding, you know, of all these supposed building back better initiatives.
Thank you very much, Sonny. Okay, let's go to another question, but okay, let's perhaps I can ask Novell this question given his interesting presentation. So Novell, you've covered about disaster risk financing, the ex-ante type, and you highlighted the experience of Mexico. So what do you think are the lessons that we can learn from Mexico's experience in having a disaster trust fund, particularly in terms of the design aspect, focusing on the safeguards that must be in place to ensure fiscal discipline and accountability?
Yeah, thank you, Sheila. Perhaps siguro three important elements that are worth noting in Mexico's experience. One, of course, is yung certainty of the funding, because in Mexico, I think through legislation, there's the requirement of, as I said earlier, 0.4% of the national budget should go to the trust fund. So that by itself is already something that, you know, provides a certain level of certainty in terms of funding. Then, of course, the second one is yung cost-sharing arrangement of both national and local governments, because what is happening right now is that national government is the first and last responder to disaster. So much of the fiscal burden is being carried by the national government. So you have to look at it in terms of cost sharing, because local governments do have the funds. And by looking at the National Disaster Trust Fund structure, there is some avenues there for them to be able, like for instance, there is this project of the ADB. It's called the Philippine City Disaster Insurance Pool. So basically, ang participants dito are cities. So they pool their resources and they buy, I think parametric insurance ata ito eh. I mean, what's good about parametric kasi is that ang trigger niya kasi is defined. Like for example, meron kang rainfall of 10 mm of rainfall, tapos naka-define na rin yung payout. So you don't need, unlike yung mga sa traditional insurance na kailangan meron ka pang mga verification, may adjuster pa na nag-verify nung ano. This one, this particular system, so naka-prepared na siya in advance and very clear, very defined yung mechanism. for approval and release. And this is what also Mexico is doing. Parang they're trying to adopt a mixed approach of financing instrument. Of course, hindi mo talaga maiwasan that national government appropriation will always be needed for immediate relief. Kasi yun, immediate yun eh. So you need to, of course, finance relief operations, provide cash cash subsidies to those affected by the typhoon, and at the same time yung mga medyo long term at saka medyo malalaki ang financing requirement, reconstruction, rebuilding of infrastructure, those you need to apply yung mga risk transfer instruments like insurance, like yung mga cut bonds. But of course there's always premium on the part of the government, either local or national. Of course they have to pay for the premium na but again, as I said, and I think Dr. Domingo also said that may funds, there are resources so you provide them with these opportunities so that they're able to pool the resources. Kasi ang disaster naman kasi yan parang parang you cannot parang prevent one area to be affected kasi once certain areas will be affected simultaneously, large areas of the country will be affected simultaneously. So for you to be able to attend to their rehabilitation, reconstruction needs, then you need substantial financial requirement to be able to finance this rehabilitation cost. And through this disaster risk financing strategy, isang lang kasi yung National Disaster Trust Fund It's just one element of the strategy na So you're able to attract participation from both national government and local government. Then of course, sabi ko nga kanina na this is outside the usual budget process. I mean, this is what happened during the pandemic So because certain because of the emergency nature of the event or the disaster, but again you still have to set public financial management procedure to ensure that of course there's always transparency and accountability with regards to the use of this money.
So the Fonden case sa Mexico, they allocate if I remember correctly, anong sabi mo, percentage,
0.4%.
0.4% of the total budget.
A budget, yeah.
Yes, yearly. So it's a fixed percentage.
Yes.
Diba? Yearly. Yeah, yearly. So yeah,
although nile-leverage nila yon, Sheila I mean, they don't just use that amount for relief lang or for Yung iba kasi they purchase insurance products para the benefit would be expanded exponentially.
You were talking kanina about our LGUs also having their source of funding for the RM, which is absolutely right because by law they should set aside I think 5% yata.
Yes.
5% of our local budget as Sonny, am I correct? Local calamity fund, no?
So yes, it's 5% of local regular
revenue.
Okay, and which means that with the Mandanas implementation of the Mandanas Garcia ruling, since
it will increase,
right? No, but what Sonny saw in his paper in his so many research, so many studies about the RRM utilization, di ba Sonny, mababa? Underutilized pa nga yung...
Less than 50% on average.
Oo nga yeah. Okay. Sonny, let's go to PES because there's a question here from Mr. Olandria. And he said, Dr. Domingo, these institutional buyers will, I believe, just pass this to the mass Government, you mentioned, has the fund. Why still pass this to institutional and eventually to individual buyers? Is this something to be instituted as an RA similar to that of the SEP Palawan? Your take, please.
Yeah, you may be right. No? The actual cost can be passed on to the eventual community players as well. But I guess this is part of the game in finding that sustainable equilibrium between the buyer and the seller, of ecosystem service. So I think for something to be sustainable, it has to be appropriate locally, scheme-wise. And if it entails the passing of certain monetary necessities, I guess that would be part of that game, just to have that sustainability in financial and operational initiative. So if it's going to be mainstreamed or institutionalized through policy, I guess that would allow PES and PES related schemes to be adopted better, both at the national and subnational levels. Because right now, how do you interface the operation of a quasi-government arrangement with that of public processes, specifically accounting and auditing processes within government, within the bureaucracy? You look at LGUs, you look at government agencies, and they have very strict admin processes. So how do you interface the two? So I guess we still have a lot of room for intervention and augmentation, PS and PS-like system-wise.
System-wise, yes. Thank you, Sonny. A question here. This is for you, Novel. Okay. Director Bangsal, can you elaborate more on the 20 billion for fiscal year 2019 to 2021, while the contingency dropped from 13 billion to 7 billion? He needs clarification on this.
Actually, nasagot ko siya. Anyways, I'll just repeat my I think probably one reason is to look at the utilization rate of the contingent fund. So, through parang at 2019 to 2021, I think parang 13 billion siya. Then, I think 2022 ata was reduced to 7 billion. But I forgot to mention that in 2023, it went back to 13 billion again. So, anyways, kasi you have to consider yung use kasi ng contingent fund. So basically, it's a lump sum fund that is used for urgent projects and activities. In fact, this also includes this does not preclude the inclusion of domestic and foreign travels of the president. So that is in the general provisions of the GAA. So it's a lump sum basically. So possible reason why it was reduced in 2022 was because based on our observation, medyo hindi ganun kataas yung utilization ng contingent fund. And in the same way that si Dr. Domingo was saying about the local and dream fund. So this is parang you need kasi parang disciplining mechanism for certain institutions so that they're able to avoid underutilization of funds. So I think again from a perspective of public financial management, I think it would be better since lump sum kasi yung contingent fund and we're leading towards more line item budgeting. That's why we're trying to prevent or minimize yung mga lump sum allocations.
Yes.
Because yun nga it's in terms of accountability and transparency, this may challenge, may certain level of challenge with regards to lump sum.
Thank you for that, Novel. Professor Atienza, we have a question here from Wilfredo Owitan, and may I so this to you, since your presentation mentioned about livelihood activities, so he wanted to know, Wilfredo wanted to know a concrete and sustainable livelihood initiatives that the government, private sector, and NGOs provided right after the disaster. Perhaps you can, in the context of the Yolanda, did this transform the affected communities? Is there a difference in terms of impact if we compare their implementation? Let's say if it's implemented by the government, implemented by the private sector, or by an NGO. Ma'am, you're on mute.
Okay, thank you for the question. One of the better examples of livelihood programs that we came across was initiated actually by several international NGOs with the help of the local government, focused on giving livelihood opportunities for women, and that is in terms of focusing on the local products like bag making and crafts making. But the international NGOs realized that in order to really make the project sustainable, they also have to teach the women how to budget, the basic skills on financing, and they have to link up with BPI because they realize that they should also not just be able to produce these products. They should also learn how to market them, present them better. So in the process, they were assisted in the different aspects of having a livelihood program. And in the process, because the target beneficiaries are women, they also incorporated gender awareness. So in the process, women also become more empowered. They learn new skills in terms of management of the business, and in the process also how to market the business. Although I recently learned that their main problem now is how to source the raw materials because of increasing urbanization and the transformation of agricultural lands into commercial and real estate. They're losing the sources of the materials needed for these baskets and other products that can be woven into commercial products. So they have to source from other places, and they said that the problem is the quality is different if they source from other places. So that's one problem that they are encountering now. But at least that particular system survives because the stakeholders have a more holistic process. The idea that people should not only learn how to do or produce a product, they should also learn how to market it, organize the business, and manage the business. And in the process, also learn values like the gender consciousness in the community. In terms of some more government initiated livelihood projects, some of them fail because they are ready-made packages that are not fit for a particular community. For instance, some women receive a kit in order to sell, for instance, cooked meat products while they because of course, as women, many of them stay at home. But the problem is the government agency that provided them these packages did not anticipate that they are staying in areas without electricity. Therefore, they cannot store the meat product. So in the process, they were not able to sell everything because they have to eat everything all at once. Otherwise, the products will spoil. So in a way, even government agencies have to understand that they have to think about the situation of the beneficiaries of their livelihood products. Not everyone will be staying in places with electricity, with water. So these environmental factors will also have to be supplied to people to have more sustainable livelihood.
Thank you, Professor Atienza. Then we have another question, but this time it's on the logistical issues, logistical problems seen during the Yolanda, particularly in terms of the distribution of aid to the beneficiaries. And this one is from Jomel Alpizalas. He's asking if you can comment on your take on these issues, and what action has been done, what action was made or implemented by the government to address this challenge during in that disaster, and perhaps you can also provide some recommendations on how we can better improve coordination and logistics during an emergency.
Okay. There were, of course, a lot of problems that were highlighted in mass media regarding the distribution of goods and other relief items. But the better equipped and perhaps more prepared LGUs have a more centralized system where they have a list of coordinators who were assigned to various areas in their community. So if there are goods that arrive, then they go to specific area. So that means that at least major areas in a particular municipality receive the relief operations. But definitely there are areas that have either they don't have the capacity or they don't have a coordinating system in place during Typhoon Yolanda, or some of them have some of them definitely admitted that they were overwhelmed by the impact and the devastation of Yolanda. So there were no people ready to actually assume the distribution for that particular area. So in this case, we really need higher level local governments to actually come in certain areas. But in terms of recommendations and lessons learned, this is where the distribution system should already be in place as part of the DRRM plans of the LGU, so that when relief comes in, when relief items come in, then there's already a distribution system in place. And if in case, for instance, LGUs who are the front line of the relief operations are unable to actually perform because they were also victims of the typhoon, then the higher level LGUs or even national government agencies should actually be in place. The main problem there was there was a lot of confusion on who would be the responsible authorities to give the relief goods. So hopefully these things can be better coordinated in future disasters.
Thank you, Prof. Ella. And Dr. Sonny, one of your ways forward was in order to effectively institutionalize PES was increasing buy-in of the private sector, because much is, in terms of payments is more of compliance still at the moment, less of voluntary payments from the private sector. How do you think can we increase buy-in of the private sector? Would you have any ideas in mind on how we can promote this, how we can realize this?
Yes, thanks, Sheila. But before I answer that, I guess I'll add something to what Dr.
Sure, go ahead.
relayed earlier. So I guess that question on logistics first was heavily tackled a year before Yolanda in 2012 when Typhoon Pablo devastated the Compostela region area. That area, there was a lot of damage coming from that typhoon. That following as well, if you recall, Sendong in 2010, both Pablo and Sendong were in the Mindanao area. Mindanao being not your traditional recipient of intense typhoons. No? So they were surprised 2010, they were surprised again in 2012, and then you have a very big surprise in 2013 with Yolanda. But in 2012, they had that issue about logistics, no? Because a lot of both local and international humanitarian efforts came through our corridors, no, just to help the local stakeholders in Compostela. And I guess that's where they adopted first the cluster approach in terms of logistics and relief provision. So hirap na hirap sila at that time kasi labo-labo yung mga supposed stakeholders who wanted to provide relief, no. Pero in some areas there were so many, in some areas they were neglected. So how do they, the concern back then was to farm out relief in a more equal manner, equity in terms of relief provision. And that happened as well with concerns during the time of Yolanda. And then again, with Odette. No? So parang we know the concerns in terms of logistical arrangements, and supposedly our institutions are prepared to handle such. No? Pero you see on the ground evidences of non-progression in terms of us bettering what we have right now within the bureaucracy. Because what you encountered with Yolanda, you also encountered with Odette. That's in 2021.
You know, that's the thing, parang hindi tayo natututo.
Yan yung problema natin. And that's a question of institutional platform for the RRM, a bigger concern. And it's been tackled so many times in Congress. No, they wanted to have that new department of disaster resilience, just to have that continuity. You need to have an institution that will grow over time, that will mature over time. Not something that's temporary with temporary members, diba? So I think that's our main concern. We need something that's stronger institution-wise, so an institution that can really lead other institutions, both in government and outside government. And right now, OCD and DREAMC, they are doing a lot, no, DRR-wise, but we need that better, stronger structure in terms of the institutions that we have now.
And Sonny, do you think having a separate, a department, Department of Disaster Risk Reduction.
Department of Disaster Resilience.
Okay, Department of Disaster Resilience. Do you think it would solve these problems, the coordination, bottlenecks?
Yeah, not immediately. Not immediately, I guess, Sheila, because this is a very big concern. And I guess Director Bangsal knows a lot, no, because there were so many discourses with regard to a new department on disaster resilience. It's not going to be a cure-all if you have that department. No, is it going to address all our weaknesses now? Probably not in the initial years of operation, but it's something that's going to grow and mature over time.
Okay.
And that's what we need. No? An
So,
institution that
quick
is capable.
question, do you think it's a step in the right direction, having
should
that
be a step.
department? Okay.
Yeah, it should be a step in the right direction to have that more concrete institutional anchor, DRRM-wise. And I guess the current administration is going towards that because right now in 2023 April, they actually came out with an EO trying to augment NDRIMC. So it's a cluster, but a more streamlined cluster compared to the membership of NDRIMC. It's probably a step towards having a better institutional platform for the leadership on disaster risk reduction and management.
Okay.
So I guess.
Thank you. And Sonny, the question about we almost forgot that.
The buy-in,
buy-in, increasing buy-in of the private sector.
You need that because you need to have that motivation, that interest between the buyer and the seller of ecosystem services. And without the motivation coming from the private sector or the usual buyers or those who pay for services, it will not work. No PES or PS-like scheme will work without that level of high motivation between both seller and buyer. And then, of course, you need to have that intermediary that would facilitate that transaction between the buyer and the seller. May that be government or a government agency, or may that be an NGO or international development organization. It doesn't matter as long as you have a very strong intermediary that would look at the concerns of both your seller and buyer of ecosystem service.
Thank you, Sonny. And for our last question, we have one here from Mr. Bill Luz. Have pre-disaster funding requirements been considered? This may lower post-disaster requirements. Novel, this is something.
Yeah. Sheila, what's the question again?
Have pre-disaster funding requirements been considered? This may lower post-disaster requirements. Yes.
Yeah. Actually, no. I think there's a move right now. I don't know. I can't remember kung kaninong suggestion. Kasi the DOF has this catastrophe risk model that's able to estimate yung, as I na-mention ko earlier, yung annual average loss from in terms of damage from natural disasters, be it earthquake, be it tropical typhoons. So they're able to estimate yung annual average loss. So then you get the experience from the Office of Civil Defense, from sa ENDRI Council. Kasi more or less every year they have an idea of the average amount of damages and loss from natural disasters. So if you can combine this information, yung model ng DOF that's able to estimate annual average loss as well from actual losses from previous years, then I think you can use that information para you can be able to predefine or predetermine the level of NDRIM funding annually. But of course, there will always be residual risk. Ibig sabihin, parang there are certain, of course, damages that you cannot take into account. So you have to parang that's why that's very important for the strategy. Kasi since even if you have this information of DOF, you have the information from Office of the Civil Defense, there are always damages that you cannot take account of. So you have to be prepared for that. So with the disaster risk financing strategy, you can be able to attend to yung financing requirement ng immediate relief. At the same time, you're able to attend doon sa mga long-term reconstruction costs. So again, whether or not siguro yung in terms of how do you estimate ano yung requirement for NDRIM fund, para at least siguro kasi as parang suggestion namin kanina, you can convert that NDRIM fund kasi as seed capital for the for the National Disaster Trust Fund. So if you have this seed capital already that you can use for the trust fund, pwede mo na kasing i-leverage yung money to buy other risk instruments. You can buy insurance, you can leverage that for contingent credit lines, etc. etc. So more or less ganun dapat. Medyo holistic yung yung approach mo in terms of disaster risk financing.
And if I may read the comments of additional comments from Mr. Luz. He said his main point is, are we investing enough in preparedness, prevention, and mitigation, because these may save lives and loss. And he added, it is also less expensive to spend on preparedness than post-disaster response, such as the cost of evacuation versus the cost of rescue, hospitalization, etc.
Let me just add, Sheila, actually, if you look at the spending for NDRIM fund, the bulk of that money is still towards rehabilitation,
purpose,
relief, purpose, not
less
for
on the preparedness,
preparation, preparedness for disaster preparedness, So again, the way, the mindset of how we spend for the disaster money, for disaster response, I think siguro yan, tama siguro sinabi ni Mr. Billos that we should also consider yung preparatory stage.
Yeah, oo. And if kung hindi ako nagkakamali, no, 70% of the LGU fund can be used for disaster preparedness and risk reduction measures, no? So hindi lang naman yun sa post. Sonny. So
Yes, 70% of the 5% from regular.
70% of the 5%, yes, of the local calamity fund, no?
I think the key there is anything that you spend before disaster events. And all the resource mobilization that you do pre-disaster event would add to resilience, no?
That's right.
Among our stakeholders and communities. And resilience equates eventually to lesser damages.
Lesser damages.
Disaster impact. So I guess that's the key in terms of all those nitty-gritties and complicated discussions on how we use our resources.
And sadly, we are under-investing in preparedness, no? Sayang, kasi may pondo naman eh.
Yeah, we need more. We need more funds. Unfortunately, if you look at the evidence, right? We have the money at the local level, but they're not using such for mitigation-related interventions. There are a lot of dynamics within local governments because some of them would prefer to use the fund 5 years after for a more flexible use. Some of them prefer not to use that because they have other sources. Now, others, the lower class municipalities, do not really have enough to fund bigger spending for mitigation-related activities. So meron silang pondo, pero talaga yung reality is the lower class municipalities, that amount, no, that 5% of local regular revenues really is very small. No? It's not that big. And it's not going to fund big infrastructure, for example, or big mitigation-related activities. So yun lang naman. That's why NGAs, no, the national government, has a very big place in the scheme of things. And our international funding partners also have that big area for intervention.
Thank you, Sonny. Unfortunately, we have to end the discussion. Medyo nag-overtime na po tayo, but what an interesting conversation we just had. So to cap our discussion, may I ask our speakers for some brief parting words, if you have any. So let's start with Professor Atienza. Ma'am.
Yes. Thank you very much again for allowing the UP Center for Integrative and Development Studies and the Department of Political Science to share our findings. Definitely, the UP CIDS and the UP Department of Political Science are very willing to actually continue doing research, learning from our case studies, and actually producing policies, and particularly in this area of resilience and disaster preparedness. We put a lot of premium on how we can actually empower people to actually demand accountability, know the responsibilities of national and local governments about disaster preparedness, and at the same time to actually empower them to actually have a more leading role in terms of actually defining and planning for the disaster preparedness plans and the climate change mitigation plans of their local government. Because people should actually be the ones defining, and in the process also check on the responsibilities, powers, and functions of national and local government. Thank you.
And thank you very much to Professor Maria Ella Atienza of UP CIDS. And of course, maybe hear from CPPRD Executive Director Novel Bangsal. Novel, please.
As usual, Sheila, thank you to PIDS and to our SERP-P family for this opportunity. I hope we have more opportunities for this knowledge exchange. Just 2 points is one, siguro is we really need to, again, parroting what Mr. Billius is saying, we need to have some paradigm shift in the way we approach disaster response from a DRFI strategy or context. And secondly, I think I would also invite our experts and our speakers, because the DDR bill is still at the committee level. So hindi pa siya advanced. So I think there's still time and window for our inputs to be considered in the deliberation in the DDR. Kasi I think maybe perhaps they should also look at these insights. I'm sure they've seen this, but siguro kailangan we need like from our end, yun nga, we're trying to push for the insertion ng DRFI in the bill, because right now parang hindi pa siya ganun ka well articulated in the bill. So I think because last Congress parang medyo ginahol na kami sa oras, but I think there's still time for all our stakeholders to be able to propose meaningful suggestions to the drafting of the bill. Thank you again, Sheila.
Maraming salamat for those updates, and hopefully nga we see positive developments as far as the Department of Disaster Reduction is concerned. No? Sana, let's keep our fingers crossed. And of course, may we hear from our DRRM expert at PIDS, Dr. Sonny Domingo. Sonny, please.
Yes, thank you, Sheila. And thank you to your very efficient team as well. I guess bottom line is we want to see resilient communities. No, both our climate change and DRR related policies are geared towards that. Us looking at strengthening communities, and everything that we do should be towards that end. Director Bangsal mentioned that we've had a paradigm shift, or we need a paradigm shift. No, but we've actually seen that change in our policy provisions. No, looking more on that shift, no, from being responsive to proactive. Unfortunately, if you look at evidence on the ground, we are not seeing much improvement. And go back from Sendong, Pablo, Yolanda, and then more recently Odette, Paeng, and then Marawi, you see a lot of room for improvement. And I guess policy, institutional augmentations, and possibly the actual grounding of such provisions, no, have to be looked at and made better. What we need, as I mentioned earlier, is an institution that would lead, that would grow over time, that would allow for us to have a more matured way of dealing with disaster events in the future. And that's not what we are seeing right now, because years and years of exposure to so many disasters, may they be natural or man-induced, have resulted to almost the same thing, you know, over and over, which is us suffering from impacts. And we need to change. You know, we need to be better if we want to have a better Philippines, a more resilient community, a happier community, you know, in the end. So with that, maraming salamat ulit, Sheila, and to all our resource speakers and to all our viewers as well. Thank you.
At maraming salamat din, Sonny, at sa inyong lahat, sa ating mga guests. Thank you very much for your insights, the nuggets of wisdom that you shared with us today. So friends, please join me in thanking them through a big virtual clap.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and here are the winners of our webinar raffle. We have Doreen Zules from the Center for Policy and Executive Development of the University of the Philippines. From Zoom, Elsa Alonso from the Development Bank of the Philippines Mandaluyong branch. And another winner from Zoom, Crispin Dizon from the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas. So Doreen, Elsa, and Crispin, our webinar team, will contact you for the delivery of your prize. And finally, friends, we have some reminders before we finally close. You can access all the presentations from today's webinar on the PIDS website. You can access them from the events page. And please also answer the feedback survey that will pop on your screen after this webinar. Your comments are important to us to improve our events. In addition, please regularly visit our website and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We also have a YouTube channel where you can access the recordings of our events. And you can also find many knowledge materials from our SERP-P page, which the URL of which is on the screen. And the SERP-P website contains not only knowledge resources of PIDS, but also knowledge resources of our member institutions. And we have one more webinar for this month. We have our webinar on transforming education in the Philippines, insights and innovations. This will be held next Thursday, same time, 2 to 4:30 in the afternoon. And this webinar is in partnership with the Innovations for Poverty Action. So we hope you can join us again next week. And finally, we would like to acknowledge the various organizations from the government, academia, civil society, business, and international development community that join us today, including our friends from the media. Maraming salamat po. So this concludes our virtual policy forum. Again, our sincerest thanks to our partners in the SERP-P network for your continued support, and to all our guests and participants on Zoom and Facebook for your active participation. So we hope to see you again in our next events. Let us do our part and work together in building a disaster-resilient Philippines. Maraming salamat po at magandang hapon.